Hello, everyone. I hope that you all had a wonderful weekend. I wanted to take a moment to welcome you to our next week. So, as you can tell, we're just really quickly going through all of the material. This next week, we are going to continue our studies on gifted education programming and services. And actually, I think this is one of the more involved assignments, but from looking at previous students who have already taken the course, this has been one of their favorite assignments because it's very practical. So before I introduce this week's work, I want to recap on our discussion board post last week. So for this learning module, we're looking into various types of gifted education programming. In the video last week, I introduced you to the concept of having both acceleration, which is typically, for general terms, delivering content either more condensed manner or more quickly. Acceleration, and then also enrichment. And enrichment is when we think about going deeper into the content. As research has shown, and as we have discovered over and over again in our class, there's a lot of support for acceleration that goes against what many of us think in terms of the social and emotional needs of our students. But as we have discussed, it's very important for students who are gifted to be with their intellectual peers. And particularly giving acceleration options allow them to be with others who may understand what's going on in their brain more than their same age peers. So if we think about enrichment, though, I did want to take one moment just to talk through enrichment because it can be very effective. So typically when we consider enrichment, it should be deeper analysis of the content that the students are studying in their regular education classroom. A lot of times what happens with gifted education programming is we have what's called a pull-out model, and the students will leave the classroom for maybe, I think it was half a day each week when I was consulting at one area, and I noticed that, so they were pulled out for this half a day each week, and they did the majority of their time was spent doing enrichment activities, which is great, but these enrichment activities did not follow the actual content that was being learned in the regular education classrooms. So it's almost as if the enrichment activities were a whole other curriculum, and we had the gifted education curriculum that the students met once a week, and they went deeply into some interesting content. But that content was only visited once a week in the gifted pull-out classes. So research has definitely shown that enrichment can be effective, but the key for effective enrichment is to carefully align that enrichment to what is being done in the classroom. If you think about a student who's participating in pull-out services, if they're pulled out once a week to do what seems to them to be very random material, then they're not going to see the connection between, oh, my gifted course and my normal life and when I'm in all of my other classes. So in order for enrichment to be done effectively, there needs to be a lot of collaboration between the gifted teacher and the regular education teacher so they can know what are the content areas that we're investigating. What are some ways that we can bring this deeper? So for example, I've seen one really great enrichment activity. It was about, in the regular education classroom, they were studying the Black Plague. And then in the gifted education classroom, they actually went into some kind of mathematical model of how the Black Plague was so quickly spread. So you see how that's not random. I'm studying the Black Plague in my history class, and then I'm taking it one step further in my gifted education course, rather than just saying I have this random gifted unit that I only get to visit once a week. So I did want to point that out and say that enrichment can be effective, but it does need to be carefully planned. When we look at last week's discussion post, I had you investigate Mr. Draper's gifted education program and particularly look into those gifted education standards from NAGC. The majority of you all started off your discussion post by pointing out the great fact that Mr. Draper provided a clear definition of giftedness as well as a clear mission statement for his program. That to me was one of the biggest strengths of this program, is that they had a clear definition of what giftedness meant, and they had some pretty well aligned services provided as well. As you all mentioned, his program follows what we call the level of services approach. So we have some activities and opportunities that are available to all students, and as those opportunities become more specific, then they're available to less students. When we are dealing with the highly gifted, giving mentorships and some of those level 5 services are definitely the most effective. So I definitely found the level of services approach to be effective. I was happy to see that they started with a definition, and within that definition, I believe it was Larissa that pointed this out. Within the definition, they claimed that these students require a differentiated approach to education. So they basically proved why gifted education is important and necessary within the definition that they gave. Another strength that I wanted to point out was that there was a committee to consistently review whether or not these services were actually helping the students. As I believe it was Riley mentioned, there was not much information about how the teachers are trained to deliver these different options, and I agree that's a definite weakness. And I think to kind of play off of her point, we have this idea of a committee that's putting together a review every year, but I don't know what that review is based on. So how are they assessing whether or not these programs are working? How are they changing and adapting based on those assessments? And as Riley pointed out, most importantly, are we providing the necessary training for these services to be appropriately delivered? A couple of other things that you all mentioned. Anna Marie did a great job talking about how they use a variety of assessments in order to identify students for gifted programming. Looking into a variety of assessments is particularly important when we start to think about students from traditionally underrepresented populations, because it's a fact that there's a lot of bias in standardized tests. And if we only use one measure to recognize giftedness, first off, that's not very reliable or valid. But second off, we're really doing some other students a disservice. Delisha did a great job pointing out the flexibility of this program, which I think is important in terms of the differentiation. So it wasn't like you had to stay in one level, but the levels were all inclusive and students were able to participate at various degrees. And all of you did a great job pointing to the alignment between our definition of giftedness and our services that we are providing. If I had to give kind of an elevator speech of how I liked this program, the best way I could describe it is it almost seems too good to be true. They provide a very involved definition of giftedness. So we have general intellectual ability, that would be like an aptitude test. Specific academic ability, those are more of your achievement tests in math and potentially English. And then they also have creativity and leadership and performing arts and fine arts, which is great, and I totally agree with that. But I would have some concern that all of those students are being appropriately served, and that also they're being served based on how they are identified. So if I am identified as gifted because of my leadership abilities, I hope that I would be served because of those leadership abilities. I believe Riley had this quote. Yes, it is unfair to provide gifted students with identical resources. I think that's an excellent quote, and Levels of Services does a good job of getting away from that. But also, when we have so many options, my concern from a consulting perspective is that all of those options are appropriately delivered and that we are appropriately training all of our teachers and administrators to deliver those options. One of the consulting projects that I did, we started out super broad, and then we quickly learned that we had a lack of resources and we had to actually narrow our definition of giftedness in order to ensure that we could provide appropriate aligned services. But I do really like this model. I'm particularly happy to see that Mr. Draper in this case is thinking about giving a clear definition and a clear mission statement, and then carrying that over into the services that he is providing. So in terms of this week's assignment, somewhat similar to the discussion post, your assignment is to analyze a gifted education program. However, I want you to choose a gifted program, either that you have had a personal experience with, or that you have a student who has had personal experience with. So for those of you who are currently teaching, I would love for you to choose the gifted education program at your school or perhaps at your district. For those of you who are undergraduate students, and maybe you yourself were a gifted student, you are welcome to choose a gifted education program that you were a part of, or perhaps a gifted education program that you have seen through your work in the field. Perhaps you have a child who is in a gifted program, or maybe a younger brother or a sister. Any of those are fine. You just need to make sure you choose a program that you can find some information about. Now, this is going to be a challenge. You will quickly see in the real world, it is not always simple to understand what's going on in these gifted education programs. So if you look into your module assignments, this is called a programming critique. And I'm asking you to look for 5 things about your gifted education program that you will be analyzing. The first, does this program provide a definition of giftedness? If it provides the definition, do you think this is an effective definition? Number 2, how are students identified to receive these services? Do you think this is an appropriate way to identify the students? Number 3, what services are provided? What does this look like? Is it mainly acceleration, where we have an honors program? Is it more enrichment? We're doing some pull-out. Maybe it's a little bit of both. 4, what are some areas for improvement? And 5, what are some areas of strength? So what is the definition of giftedness? How are students identified? What are the services that are provided? Areas for improvement and strengths. As you are writing this up, I want you to be sure to use your materials from the library. Definitely be thinking about those NAGC programming standards. And really the challenge is to take all of this idealistic library content and apply it to a real-world program that you are either currently working in or that you have had experience with in the past. One thing I want to make really clear, it might not be possible to answer all of these questions. You do need to do some digging through the school's website, talking to other teachers, maybe contacting a parent of a child who has been identified as gifted. I want you to exhibit a lot of effort in finding these answers. But if you have searched and asked your principal, asked your other administrators, talked to all the teachers, you don't even know how students are identified to be gifted. You just know they walk into your classroom and some are gifted and some are not. That's your answer. So you would need to tell me in your write-up, these are the ways that I tried to find this material. I was unable to find the answer, and this is why that's important. So if you are not able to find one of these answers, that's fine. I just need you to give me some background about why. I love this assignment. It's a really good opportunity for you to start thinking real world and practically. How can you translate all of these kind of idealistic theories that we study and look at how does that impact you on a day-to-day basis. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know, and I hope that you all have a wonderful week.